So we're in the car now, and eyes on the road. That was scary. No, actually, well, I'll get to it, but that not the scariest thing in a car yet today. I forgot to pack a jacket, so I'm freezing cold right now. It's looking like it might be a difficult thing to get picked up. Weird, right? So apparently I'm supposed to go through here, stay on the road obviously, but go through here to get to Paiute Mama. She's gonna have a phone apparently. And if I can get there, then I can call and figure out what my next move is. So yeah, because it looks like, I don't know if I'm gonna be able to make this like 6 days, I feel like 4 or 5 might be it, because I also just remembered I forgot my chapstick too. And my gloves, so my hands are like falling off, frozen. It's really bad. So now I'm waiting to get picked up. Kidding. So we're in the car now, heading back home. But let me explain how I got here, right? So I go down to this place, right? That's on the trail register. They're saying, "Oh, come here," right? Right before I get there, right? There's this guy in a truck who comes by, and I'm kind of lost at this point. So this guy comes by in this truck, right? And I'm like, I wave him down, and he comes over, and he's like, "Hey," and I'm like, "Oh, hi, I'm trying to get to this place. This person calls himself Paiute Mama, is apparently like a trail, angel of some sort, right?" He's like, "Oh, yeah, sure. She's up that way," right? He points me out to where I need to go. I'm like, "Cool, thank you." And he's like, "One other thing though, she's not very reputable." I'm like, "She's not what?" He says, "Reputable." I'm like, "Reputable, huh?" And he says, "She's got a warrant out for her arrest." So I'm like, okay, now I'm like worried about this whole thing, right? And he's like, "They're really nice people though, don't worry." I'm like, okay. So anyway, so I get down there, and so they apparently just had a run-in with the police because somebody in the area went missing. So they searched everybody in the area, right? So they searched them, and so like all their doors, and they weren't there, so like all their doors are like busted in, all the locks destroyed, stuff just ransacked, right? And they're like, "Sorry it's so messy," and I'm like, "It's fine," right? Because I'm like, this sounds horrible, right? So they're telling me all about how horrible it is, and how the cops just, are horrible, blah, 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 right? And I'm like, yeah, it's hard to argue with that, if they just came in and ransacked your house, right? Also, they have these 2 dogs. One of them's like this big golden retriever mix. The other's like this, I don't know, this little dog, right? And they're both pretty nice. And although the big one, barked at me a lot, right? But clearly I could tell these were, not gonna eat me or anything, right? Right off the bat, which was nice. But they were like, "Oh, we have 7 dogs. 5 of them are currently missing." I was like, "Oh my gosh, what?" And they're like, which also, I was sort of not surprised because the gate was like way open. It wasn't like I had to open a gate or anything to get in there. It was just come in and out. Anyway, so long story short, they were kind of strange. I was a little worried, but they were really nice, and they were like, "Oh, well, we can take you to town, right?" And I was like, "Well, honestly, I just need to use a phone." And they were like, "Okay, we'll check the internet." I went, "Okay." So they go in, they check the internet, they come back, and they're like, "We don't have an internet right now." I was like, "You don't? Oh, that's too bad." And they're like, "We use Magic Jack, so that's why we need the internet." I'm like, "Oh, okay, sure." I was like, I kind of just assumed that for whatever reason they needed the internet to call anyway. But they were like, "Yeah, that's why." And I was like, "Okay." And they were like, "It's something like you don't use it, you lose it," or something like that. And I was like, whatever. And they were like, so we don't have internet right now. I'm like, yep, that sucks. And so they were like, so you can't make a call. And I was like, okay, well, this whole time I'm on, the inReach, right? The little satellite communicator, like, hey, come pick me up. I'm just sending you guys stuff like, oh, come get me. You're like, when, where, what do you, and I'm like, gosh, I need to have a phone so I can actually just get this across real quick. Anyways.
I wasn't sure if you were injured or dying, and then I saw you were at a very secluded, abandoned-looking house far away from anything else and not able to call me, which kind of wondering if it was a Criminal Minds type situation.
Criminal Minds type.
Yeah.
Well, it was that kind of setting, but it didn't turn into that at all. They also wanted me to and then they were like, oh, well, do you want water? I'm like, sure. So they give me this water. They're like, oh, it's from the well or whatever. I'm like, cool. And they're like, oh yeah, I dug that well with my, father, in the 70s or something. Like, that's really interesting. There's hair and dirt in this water, but okay, sip, sip. Then she's like, well, let's go over to the trailer that I have set up. I'm like, okay. She's like, also, if you need it, there's a non-denominational steeple right over there. And I turn around, I'm like, yes, there is. Okay. And so then, you know what? I don't know. There's a totally different breed of people than what I'm used to. But so all of this was really weird. But I was like, okay. And then, and I hope they never see this, right? I mean, they don't currently have internet, but what if they do at some point, right? Careful, there's a cop. Oh man. So anyway, so then she's like, so we have that other house over there, right?
Yeah, there were several buildings I could see on the area.
Yeah. So they're like, there's that other house, which is for the hikers, and it's kind of the first thing you see. And I was like, yeah, it was. I was kind of thinking if I should go down there. They're like, no, it's just, this other house. Meanwhile, she's like, oh, do you mind, or she was like, oh, do you smoke weed? I'm like, no. And she's like, oh, do you mind if I smoke weed? I'm like, no, go ahead. And she's like, okay, cool. And she's like, don't worry, I'm legal and everything. I'm like, oh, that's great. That's good.
What?
And then she's got a license or whatever. I was like, whatever.
Drive you.
So then, well, she didn't drive. Larry drove. So her boyfriend Larry. So he was like, and then the whole time he's going around checking everything, right? And he's like grumbling to himself because cops just raided their place and everything's trashed, right? Also, a lot of their stuff is missing and they're blaming it on their neighbors. They're like, it was Steve or whoever down the road. They're like, I'm gonna have to go talk to that guy. I was like, okay. This whole time they're going on about the politics of their neighborhood or whatever, right?
Wow.
This whole Weldon, Kelso Valley region.
Okay.
Oh my gosh. Anyways, this is gonna be a long take here. This is 10 minutes of talking. So
keep going.
So yeah, I gotta finish this. So the whole thing is okay, whatever, right? So long story short, they show me around the place. It's totally trashed. Cops came in, whatever. They also show me a trailer. They're like, what do you think? Could we put hikers in here? I'm like, sure. I mean, it's a bed, so it's good. It looks pretty decent, right? And so then they're like, okay, well, let's get going. I got there 10, right? We left at 12:30, right? So I was there 2.5 hours talking to these people. And then they were like, you want a candy bar? I'm like, no, I'm good. They're like, do you eat, pork? I'm like, no, I don't. Because otherwise you're gonna keep asking me, right? But then they did anyway. They're like, do you want a bagel? I could get some pork and some cream cheese or whatever and a bagel or something like that. They had some sort of, it sounded pretty good, but I was like, I got food. I've only been out here 4 days. They were like, are you sure? They were like, we just started this whole Trail Angel thing, and so we've been We've been, so we've been, like, they were like, yeah, last year we had like several hundred people come through here. I'm like, sure. And they were like, we even had this one time where and then they started talking about all the times they've crashed their car. I'm like, I don't want to hear about this. You're about to drive me somewhere.
Right.
Don't tell me about how you crash your car like every few years. As we're getting into the car, this woman, Mama, she's like, she whispers to me like, oh, Larry carries a gun. I'm like, okay. So anyways, so I'm in the car with them, right? This is part 2. I'm in the car with them, and they have, the guy's got the gun on the, the dashboard. She's got several pieces of like pork that she's like feeding him. So he's like steering with one hand, with the other hand just holding like this pork, eating it. I'm like, man, this is so scary. Also, I'm reaching for my seatbelt, trying to get that over, and they're like, oh, no seatbelts. I'm like, what do you mean no seatbelts? They're like, this is mountain driving. If we crash, you want to be able to get out real fast, just in case. I was like, no, that's bad logic. You want to survive the crash first. But they're like, I was like, just so I don't slide around, and they're like, the seatbelts are broken. I was like, broken? And they're like, yeah, the things are under the seats. And oh gosh, I'm like, fine, I'm not gonna wear a seatbelt then. So then we're driving down these roads where it's like that close to maybe falling over. It was real freaky. But they were setting up caches and everything. I was like, oh, that's really nice of them, right? And then finally, we're driving through Weldon, and they're like, Weldon is just a bunch of, Weldon's just a bunch of drunks and meth addicts, meth heads. I was like, okay. And then they started talking about some person who lived there who was like really mean, but also was like dying and was like on a feeding tube or something. I was like, what is this conversation? What? Yeah. I mean, okay, but like, it was weird. Also, they're like smoking in this car, right? And they're like, you don't mind, right? I'm like, I guess I don't, because, whatever. You're gonna, yeah, exactly. Better than walking. Well, they seem nice. They seem like if I said, no, I don't want you to smoke, they'd be like, whatever, fine. And they stop smoking. But I was like,
cigarettes
whatever. Cigarettes at that point. And then they were accusing like the cops or somebody of like stealing their dogs. I was like, I don't think anybody stole your dogs. Your gate's wide open. Anyway. And then they were like, well, if they're at the pound, that's gonna really suck, because then we're gonna have to pay money to get them out of the pound. I was like, oh man. Anyways.
Pound somewhere up here?
I don't know. But they were doing a lot of errands today, and they were talking about how they don't leave. They try to only leave once a week or something. I was like, whatever. And then, yeah, they seem to be down to their last of everything. They were like, last candy bar, last smokes, last bit of pot. I was like, geez, this is, yeah, okay. But it was just, it was a weird experience. I thought we were going to fall off a cliff and die for several points. And, yeah, and then Mama started talking about, she was like, you ever eat squirrel? Because I saw a squirrel. I was like, yeah, squirrel. And they were like, have you ever eaten a squirrel? And I was like, no. And she's like, oh, well, I did once, 6 months ago or something like that. And then the guy who's driving, Larry, right, her boyfriend, is like, he's like, what? He's surprised of this too. He's like, what? And she's like, yeah. And he's like, I didn't know about this. And like, he's angry. And then, which that was the weird thing too, was he was like angry the whole time, but then he like wasn't. He was like jokingly angry the entire time. This was like his whole shtick. I was like, so, and then also he couldn't hear anything. Like, he obviously had bad hearing, because she was like shouting at him from like 10 feet away, and he was like, as he's like trying to fix like, some post or something. That was the other thing. They were like, we're in the process of remodeling. I was like, well, okay, sure, because it looks like that house right there is half built, right? Because there was this whole like other house deal that was like, had everything but like a roof. So I was like, okay, I don't know, they were building constantly apparently, and but it looked like an uphill battle. Unfortunately, it was just weird.
Wow.
And so anyways, the whole thing was very strange. But yeah, and they were yeah.
But they gave you the ride.
But they gave me a ride, and I made it to Paul's place, And then eventually you guys came and got me, and it worked out.